through Stanford University. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Walker with us today. We decided to keep it virtual to make sure that everyone had access. And he is just visiting Hawaii briefly, although he's based at Stanford doing his postdoc there. Today, he's going to give us a talk entitled Text and Bitext in Middle Cambodia. And I will just describe briefly the topic of the talk, and I will remind people that this is being recorded. So if you feel like you need to hear it a second time, we'll make it available as soon as we can. Stone inscriptions carved at Angkor Wat and other Cambodian temples between the 16th and 18th centuries cite or quote from more than 20 different Buddhist titles. This talk identifies these titles on the basis of surviving palm leaf manuscripts in Cambodia and situates them in the broader history of Southeast Asian Buddhism. Most of these titles were transmitted and performed as bitexts, including those composed in a bilingual Pali-Khmer sermon format. The epigraphic evidence confirms the primacy of bitexts in Theravada intellectual life during this period, forcing us to rethink the relationship between vernacular and cosmopolitan discourse in mainland Southeast Asia. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Walker. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Stark, for that kind introduction. And thank you also to Professor Chani Sack-Humphrey, to Yim Savun, and to Sarah Lowe, and to others behind the scenes who've made this event today possible. I'm really delighted to have the chance to be here in Hawaii and to give this talk for the University of Hawaii Center for Southeast Asian Studies webinar series this fall in 2021. A special welcome to all of you in the future who are watching this talk after the fact. I hope life is going all right for you during that time. And also, I just wanted to say that I'm really looking forward to all of your questions after I finish my presentation. I'm going to talk for about 45, 50 minutes. And to ask questions, you can, again, just use the Q&A function on the webinar, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end to get to some of your questions. Thank you again. As Professor Stark mentioned, my talk today is centered around text and bitext in Middle Cambodia. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by bitexts in particular a little bit later into the talk. As I begin, though, I'd like to provide a little bit of framework around this question of Middle Cambodia, some of the sources I'll be using, particularly inscriptions and manuscripts, before getting to the key questions that I'll be working through in my talk today. So as many of you know, this term Middle Cambodia refers to a particular period in Cambodia's history, namely from the shift of power away from Angkor and the ancient city of Yashodarapura to a series of power centers around the intersection of the Mekong and the Lesap rivers, be it in Phnom Vek or in Udong, or near the present-day capital of Phnom Penh, up to the period of the French colonial era. And during these centuries, the textual as well as the material record is dominated by Theravada Buddhism. And it's this very textual record that I'll be speaking to today. On the material side, some of you know much more about this than I do. It's been a really exciting time for Cambodian archaeology of this period. And recent advances in the field have revealed, at least to me as someone who doesn't know much about archaeology, a really complex picture of trade, both within and beyond mainland Southeast Asia, change with new kinds of practices and materiality as compared to the Angkorian period, as well as a number of important aspects of continuity. However, for someone like me who primarily studies texts and also their performance in mainland Southeast Asia, this is a challenging period to study in Cambodia's history because particularly outside of Angkor Wat itself, there are very few stone inscriptions that remain during this period. And to complicate matters, the royal chronicles are not particularly reliable prior to the 18th century. And this also complicates our picture in trying to reconstruct an image of Cambodian society and religion during this period. One of the most important sources, and some that I'll be sharing some interpretations from today, are inscriptions written in Middle Khmer, also some in Pali from this period. Most of those that survive, around a little bit more than 40, are found at or near the 12th century temple of Angkor Wat, especially in a series of galleries, one near the top, the Prepuan gallery, as well as the very highest gallery of Angkor Wat at the center of the temple, the Bakan gallery. And on the columns and walls in this part of Angkor Wat, there are these series of inscriptions which date between the late 16th century, corresponding to the one phase of the restoration of Angkor Wat under King Angchan, and last through the early 18th century with one outlier in 1747. Each of these inscriptions are records of pious acts and truthful aspirations, sometimes referred to as Satya Pranidharana or Satya Pranathiyan, that were left by largely wealthy Khmer pilgrims who visited this site during this period. And important for my talk today, many of these inscriptions mention particular Buddhist texts by name, including texts that were chanted, read aloud for sermons, or copied onto new palm leaves. The other key source of evidence that I'll be working with in my talk today are palm leaf and also bark paper manuscripts in Cambodia. As many of you know, perhaps 95 or even as many as 98% of these manuscripts are believed to have been lost in the period between 1975 and 1990 through destruction as well as neglect. Beginning in 1990, a very important project initially funded by the AFAO, known as the FEMC, or the Fonds pour l'édition des manuscrits de Cambodge, began a project to restore, to catalog, to identify, and to also photograph on film manuscripts that still survived in different Cambodian collections, including in Phnom Penh, in Canal province, in Pong Cham, and including part of what's now in Bong Khum province, as well as a few temples in Siem Reap. And I'm currently involved in a project of the Buddhist Digital Resource Center, BDRC, called the Khmer Manuscript Heritage Project. And through that project, we've been digitizing the manuscripts curated already by the FEMC project. At present, it's about up to 14,000 manuscripts, or over 1.5 million pages of manuscripts in those 4 provinces, both digitized directly from existing manuscripts and from films, particularly in cases where the original manuscript, even since 1990, has been lost. We're hoping to open the website for that project in the spring. All the manuscripts will be freely available online. Most of the manuscripts that survive in Cambodia were copied between 1850 and 1950. But that copying was done on the basis of much older texts, and they're part of a continuous tradition in Southeast Asia, going back at least a few centuries, of the copying and recopying of these texts. Most of the manuscripts that ultimately have survived to the present are on palm leaf. Palm leaf is actually quite durable format within the difficult climatic conditions for paper-like materials in Southeast Asia. And therefore, only about 2% of the manuscripts that survive to the present are on bark paper. Almost all of the rest are on palm leaf. And most of the examples I'll be bringing out are on palm leaf. This talk is part of a broader series of questions and projects that I've been working on to move towards a history of Cambodian Buddhist literature, particularly during the middle period and in the transition from the middle period to the modern period. And I've been testing out a number of different methods to work on this question of how Cambodian Buddhist literature has changed over time. To what extent can we use materials that survive today to get a better understanding of the past? One method that I've used before is to focus just on the Pali liturgical text, the body of materials that monks, both in the present and especially the past, memorized to be able to recite at particular locations. They're often recorded on short format palm leaf manuscripts known as vian. This word vian is related to a Pali word, bharnavara or pianavira, which is a reference to the sections, the vara for bharna or recitation. In other words, the particular passages of the Pali scriptures that were selected for memorization and ritual recitation. So in one particular paper where I work on this body of material, I was trying to show the relationship between this group of Pali texts, many of which are not actually found in the Pali Tipitaka, the canon of Theravada Buddhism, but are specifically composed in Southeast Asia, sometimes in the basis of Sanskrit Buddhist texts that we know or can surmise to have been present during the Angkorian period. Another method that I've been using to try to explore this question of the history of Cambodian Buddhist literature has been thinking through the kind of regional circulation, including the kinds of scribal conventions and other ways that we can trace the history of individual Cambodian manuscripts. And in one short essay called Siamese Manuscripts in Cambodian Collections, I try to show how quite a significant number of the palm leaf manuscripts in Cambodia, particularly in Phnom Penh, were actually brought to Cambodia from Siam, what's now Thailand. And we see traces of that in the colophons, that is the notes left by the scribes of these manuscripts and other kinds of paleographic information, particularly around Pali manuscripts that ended up being in part of important royal collections and other large monastic libraries in the capital. I'll be mentioning a little bit later on the importance of thinking about the relationship between Siamese and Khmer Buddhist literature during this period. Another method is comparing, and one that I'll be using in this talk as well, is comparing inscriptions and manuscripts, trying to find links between them. So some of the evidence that I'll be discussing today relates to a recently published paper in Utai, Journal of Khmer Studies, called Carved Chants and Sermons on Stone, in which I look at some of the specific inscriptional evidence and how it can help us better appreciate the historical layers within the surviving manuscript libraries of Cambodia. And then finally, related to a broader project that I'm engaged in on the intellectual history of translation and bilingualism within Southeast Asian Buddhist cultures. That project is largely centered actually in Laos and Thailand, but I'm also bringing Cambodian material into it as well. And that involves recentering the Pali-Khmer bitext. That is a text that combines together a Indic prestige language like Pali or Sanskrit with a local vernacular, in this case, Khmer, to form a interphrasal or interlinear kind of arrangement. And I'll be showing some examples of that later on. So some of the other work I've been doing is trying to understand the history of this particular form in Southeast Asia and its importance for understanding literary production, particularly Buddhist literary production in Cambodia during this period. For my talk today, I'm going to primarily be grounded in three questions. One, what genres did Cambodian Buddhists transmit between the late 16th and early 20th centuries? Two, how did these genres evolve over this period? And three, in what ways do these changes reflect regional shifts across mainland Southeast Asia in the composition, translation, performance, and also transmission of Buddhist texts and bitexts? So I'll begin with this question of what genres are present during this period of Cambodian Buddhist literature. Some of the most important early work that was done on Cambodian manuscripts, particularly those of the Buddhist tradition, was done by O Chiang, here reflected in his 1953 Catalogue du Fonds Khmer of primarily the manuscripts from Cambodia held at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. For O Chiang, he saw Cambodian manuscripts as divisible into three main categories. Manuscripts used for monastic sermons, labang, manuscripts to be read aloud for aesthetic appreciation or enjoyment, and finally, kbuan, practical manuals. We see reflections of this basic structure in the system developed by the FEMC through the efforts, particularly of Olivier de Bernon, Kun Sophiep, and Langkok An, here in their the first volume of their catalog from 2004 that divides the surviving collection of Cambodian manuscripts into 7 principal categories, including a category for moral codes and Buddhist poems, another for fables and classical novels, another for preaching texts drawn from Buddhist scripture, sastrate, another for the actually quite small number of texts that survive today that are historical chronicles like the Richabong Sabala or other local chronicle traditions, a broad category called Kumpi Boran that brings together different cosmological, legal, and meditation treatises that weren't necessarily intended to be read aloud, but to be used as reference works, as well as a variety of practical manuals, or kbuan boran. And then finally, all of the Pali texts were grouped together. This system also has a number of different subcategories, and it's those subcategories that I've represented in parentheses on this page. When I think through the different languages, genres, and topics of Cambodian Buddhist literature, this is the map that I use. It's a little bit modified from the FEMC system, and this is also the map that will essentially be the basis for users who will get a chance to browse the future Khmer and English language site of the Buddhist Digital Resource Center for this collection of digitized Cambodian manuscripts. And that is to think through the ways in which these texts can be divided into those in Khmer verse or Khmer prose, those that are bitexts, and particularly in a strict sense of the term, particularly the mixed Pali and Khmer preaching texts, as well as mixed Pali and Khmer treatises, and finally, mixed Pali and Khmer manuals. And then the Pali literature of Cambodia can also be divided into a number of categories. Some of these are well known within the Buddhist tradition as a whole, as in the tripartite division of the Pali, the Pitaka, the 3 baskets into the Vinaya, Sutta, and Abhidhamma, but it also relying on local Southeast Asian categorizations of Pali texts, including Sadavi Sesa, those that are primarily concerned with language, prosody, grammar, a category I mentioned before of the largely memorized liturgical chants on short format palm leaf, the Bharnawara texts, and then finally a related category of monastic ritual chants, not intended for public performance for lay people, but primarily for within the monastic community known as Kamawaja. In past research on this vast body of both secular and Buddhist literature that survives in Cambodia, the principal genres that have been worked on are the moral codes, what we might refer to as Chibap Tunumian, the classical novels, this particular category of Sastra Labang, sometimes referred to as Berlam Lok Boran, as well as some of the legal codes that have survived between the composed between the 16th, 17th century and the present, the various historical texts, particularly chronicles, as well as meditation treatises. So we can look, for instance, to the really important work of Philip Jenner here at the University of Hawaii on moral codes and their dating of these chabab, as well as work done by Bo Savarua on that topic. Much work has been done by scholars, particularly in 20th century Cambodia, on the history and development of the various classical novels. Also thinking here of more recent work by King Hong Lee. The legal codes through a really quite bold and exciting monograph by Gregory Miguelian on that shows the dating and development of a number of the older legal texts, allows for us to gain a much richer appreciation of this tradition and its development in Middle Cambodia. The historical texts, of course, have been worked on extensively, say recently by scholars like Thun Thira, as well as in the past by Michael Vickery, Ken Sok, and others. And the meditation treatises that have been explored in depth by François Bizot, by Olivier de Bernon, and others have shown a really rich side to the esoteric dimensions of Khmer Buddhist practice in this period. In my talk today, I'm going to be focused on another set of genres, those like Buddhist poems or Labat Prethua, these number of different bitexts used for teaching. And I mentioned a little bit about the importance of Pali liturgical texts that haven't received as much attention, even though numerically they represent a larger share of the texts that survive up to the present. There are various methods applied for the dating of Khmer texts. There, of course, is the methods of rhyme analysis pioneered by Philip Jenner and Bo Savarua, applied to the Chabab texts. We see a table of this on the left. Authorial colophons in Sastra Labang and Palam Lo Boran, particularly is collected in works by Lien Ha'an, Judith Jacob. This particular table on the right comes from a really excellent MA thesis at the Sapia by Sang Saopia from 2004. Also the legal colophons that Gregory Miguelian was able to demonstrate their historicity and the development of that tradition, as well as the kinds of intertextual analysis applied to the Richabong Savada in order to better understand and appreciate the development of chronicular traditions in Cambodia. The method I'm using is comparison with dated inscriptions. So in other words, I'm looking at the way particular Middle Khmer inscriptions offer direct quotations, stylistic features, or titles of known texts that allow us to link the manuscript record with the epigraphical one. So there are a number of direct quotations of known Buddhist texts in Pali and in Khmer that appear in the inscriptional record. Not many of these has been identified up to the present. There are also stylistic features, particularly the bitextual format that I'll address briefly, as well as particular titles of texts to be recited or copied. In this image, we see underlined in green here, this inscription from 1566 reads, Sang Preapituam Mahachiat. In other words, this particular donor sponsored the creation, in other words, the copying onto new palm leaves of two important texts, the Preapituam and the Mahachiat. We know from comparing that with later surviving manuscripts that the referent here of Preapituam is a particular Pali-Khmer text known as the Preapituam Prampil Kampi. And the Mahachiat refers to the Maha Vaisandara Jiadak, or the Vasantra Jadaka. again, in this Pali-Khmer bilingual format. In terms of some of the direct Pali quotations, here's just a simple example. This is from this same inscription, IMA 4. This quotation has been misread for a long time due to the difficulties in the spacing and parsing the Pali. But when the correct spacing is applied and the Pali is standardized to match normal Pali grammar, we read idang me vadanam sapunyutanyana pativedasa pachiyohotu. In other words, may this gift of mine, idang me vadanam, be a support pachiyohotu for the attainment of omniscience. Sapanyutanyana pativedasa. This exact phrase is coming out of the Jatakata Varna, is a particular commentary on the Vasantara Jataka. It's the prose narrative form of the Vasantara Jataka that accompanies the canonical verses. It also appears in later on in a Southeast Asian Pali text, the Panyasa Jataka as well. There are also a number of inscriptions from this period that contain direct quotations of Khmer texts. So in the case of IMA 31 and also IMA 38, there are passages in each of those inscriptions that are copied directly or slightly modified from an important liturgical chant in Khmer, the poem known in the manuscript tradition as Labao Batum, and known to contemporary performers of smoke chanting or Thobat or Dharma songs as Batum Twaipaka, or sometimes just Bat Twaipaka. And these particular passages show that one, that IMA 31 of 1684, not IMA 38 of 1701, is in fact the oldest surviving physical evidence for rhymed verse in Cambodia. And also that this text, Labao Patum, must predate by some margin the earliest inscription in which this quote appears, again, IMA 31 of 1684. So it's likely a text from the at least the mid or perhaps early 17th century. Also in the inscriptional record, we see evidence for a particular style of writing, that is the bitext, the Pali-Khmer bitextual style. We see this most clearly in one inscription, IMA 32 from 1688 of the Common Era. And this text follows this particular format of Pali words or phrases followed by expanded glosses in Khmer. So in this passage we read Ahang ri ein khnyom nak mi srek thwai bangkom pranam sarisa dak le tabong tinai sap thangai kalang ai da kalong, etc., in which a particular word in Pali like ahang, I, is then glossed in Khmer first with a particular technical particle here, ri, particle used to mark the nominative case in this particular style, and then a gloss into Khmer, I bow down low. Or excuse me, here the gloss is simply ein knyom, I, and then for the next word, napmuyami or namami in Pali is followed by, again, a gloss in Khmer, sraik twaibung kumpranam, I bow down low with my cup palms, etc. We'll see more examples of this style later, but this is the earliest physical record of this particular style of composition in Cambodia. Then also in the manuscript record, we have specific titles that show up in inscriptions that mention two kinds of meritorious acts. One, the copying of palm leaf manuscripts, which shows up in a number of inscriptions. And secondly, inscriptions that mention the act of inviting monks to chant or recite sermons. And there again, we have specific titles of Buddhist works. Among the Pali texts that we see from this period, there are those that are quoted, such as the Vasantara Jataka that I mentioned, certain pericopes that are quoted and modified, like this important pericope of repentance, beginning with Acchayo no Bhante, Ajagama, etc., that appears in the Sutanta Pitaka and the Vinaya Pitaka, but also in IMA 17 in a modified form. Certain forms of generic titles like Purita or Dipamanta that appear, as well as specific titles of known Pali texts, such as the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta or the Mahasamaya Sutta, which are texts that are recited in ritual occasions in Cambodia up to the present. Some of the clues of specific titles are a bit more cryptic. For instance, several inscriptions read Da Chlong or Da Miataka, which is understood, in my view, to be a reference to the most important text that's recited in a Da ceremony or Bon Da ceremony of making merit on behalf of the deceased. In this ceremony, 7 short excerpts of the opening Matika, or abbreviated table of contents of each of the 7 books of Abhidhamma, are recited in a form known as the Sattapakarana Matika. Then also we see the phrase Bangsakol, or sometimes Bangsakol Anicca. And the term Anicca here is a shorthand to refer to the most important Pali verse recited in that ceremony, the verse that begins Anicca Vata Sankhara Upada Vayathominao, etc., that appears particularly in IMA 37. In addition to Pali texts, we also see a few Thai texts being referenced directly in the inscriptions as texts that were performed. So in IMA 37, again, we find this phrase, Nimun Nek Samanai So Thoamat Tayao Ang Pi Prakain Bat Mui. In other words, the person who sponsored this invited 2 novice monks to chant this text, offering 1 baht of silver to each. This particular word, Thoamat Tayao, has long been misread as Thoa Gi Yao or Thoa Gu Yao. And that's obscured what's happening in this particular passage. In my understanding, this is a variant form of a text sometimes known as, in its Pali or formal title, Dhammaparti Yoga, that's pronounced in Khmer today as Thoa Yao. And there's one version of that, the Thoa Yao Xiam, that is in fact written in Thai. And we know it's the Thai text that's being referred to in 1747 because in certain colophons, in bark paper manuscripts of the Khmer version, the Thoa Yao Khmer, there is a description of the process of translating this text from Siamese into Khmer, a process that didn't take place until 1869 by a team led by the monk with the rank of Preh Thomalikut at Wat Unalam. So we see here in the background just one particular bark manuscript that preserves this text mentioned in the 1747 inscription. If we take, for instance, the passage here and we read it in Khmer, Anjung Te Sabai Yang Rup Prasasada, it doesn't make much sense in Khmer, and that's because it's using the Khmer alphabet to write in Thai, not exactly in the calm letters used more often in Thailand to write both Thai and Pali text, but in a more Khmer style. But again, though, if we read this same lines in Thai, it produces this ritual text that's still used in Buddha image consecrations. Anchern Te Sadet Yang Rup Prasasada Sadet Suam Prapatima Bopit Prachao Jung Ya Yung, etc. And in fact, it's this Siamese version that's still performed in some temples in Bungcham province up to the present day. Then also during this period, this is moving just a moment away from the inscriptions to think about this question of Siamese influence, we see evidence for the importation of Siamese manuscripts. So sometimes this shows up, as I mentioned, in the form of colophon. So this is on the cover leaf of a Pali manuscript, the Samanta Basarika, which is a commentary on the monastic Vinaya attributed to Buddhaghosa. And this particular cover colophon is written in Kham script, the form of Cambodian script that's used in Thailand to write, in this case, the Siamese or Thai language. And this particular colophon, though, is not referencing something happening just in Siam at that time, but it's quite relevant for thinking about how some of these manuscripts made their way to Cambodia. So this particular colophon reads, Pan Prat Songkhara Cha, Muang Kampucha, Kibodi, Marian Ham, Nai Muang Sia Yutia, Sangwai Samrat Prasasana. In other words, the gift of the Sangharaj of the Kingdom of Cambodia, who came to study the Dharma in the Kingdom of Ayutthaya. This manuscript was created in order to support the holy dispensation of the Buddha. And this is a mid-18th century manuscript from its paleography and is one of a number of different pieces of evidence that show how Cambodian monks were traveling, including very high-ranking monks, were traveling to Ayutthaya, to Siam during this period in order to pursue studies as well as to collect manuscripts to bring back to Cambodia. We also know, particularly during the 19th century, that a number of Siamese Buddhist compositions, either those in Pali, those in a Pali-Siamese bitextual format, or those written entirely in Siamese, were translated into Khmer during this period. So we have evidence for different forms of the Traipum cosmology were translated during this period. A number of long and important Buddhist texts that show up in Cambodian manuscript collections, such as a very long and interesting commentary on the Buddha's names, known in Khmer as the Praputakun Balai, as well as a commentary on a famous verse or set of verses about the Buddha's victories. This text is known in Cambodia today as the Daika Bihom. As well as a narrative text that I've worked on lately, known as the Depana Petia in Cambodia, all of which we can firmly say were translated from Siamese exemplars during this period. That doesn't necessarily apply to the manuscripts that show up as mentioned in the inscriptions from the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, however, where there's much less clear evidence for a direct Siamese influence on the composition and transmission of Buddhist texts in Cambodia. So here, coming back to the inscriptional record, we see titles of manuscripts to be copied, including some I mentioned before, the Apituam from Pulkampi, the Maha Waisandar Jiadak, important narrative text, the Batomatra, as well as the Thomajakapawatana Sot and the Tusa Jiadak, as all texts that are mentioned specifically as being copied during this period in acts of merit. And then in addition, we have the titles of manuscripts that are mentioned as being recited as sermons during the ceremonies recorded in the inscription. So these include a very interesting narrative text known more commonly in Cambodia as Mahalai, or the more formal title of Mialai Yatay Batai, as well as the text I'll talk about a little bit on the Buddha repaying his mother, known as the Miatakun, sometimes the Miatakun Assault. The Sangkya Yaniya Kraibai, a text I'll mention soon, as well as a series of Anisangsa texts, sermons that describe the benefits of performing particular ritual acts, that of offering tung or banners, offering preah or new Buddha images, that of dedicating merit, particularly in the closure or chlong ceremonies for various large-scale Buddhist rituals, a text known as Anisang Jamlangbon, texts on the benefits of ordaining as a monastic, the Anisang Pnua, which I'll mention again soon, as well as the benefits of listening to the Dharma in the Anisang Brethoma Guru, all of which we can see mentioned in inscriptions dating from this period. Some texts also here at the bottom in gray appear both as manuscripts and as sermons. If we think about the topics that these fit into, they represent a really wide range of the kinds of bilingual Pali-Khmer sermons that we know to exist in the manuscript collections found in Cambodia today, whether modeled on Buddhist discourses, on philosophical treatises, on past life narratives of the Buddha or Jataka texts, on other kinds of narratives, or on these Anisang or Anisangsa texts that describe the karmic benefits of performing particular actions. All are represented within the inscriptional record, providing us with a basis for understanding how these texts may have been transmitted in the past down to the present. And indeed, when we look at the numbers of manuscripts that survive to the present of the texts represented in these middle period inscriptions, we see that they are all very common and popular texts that exist in significant numbers. So the most popular of these texts, including the Apituam from Pulkampi and the Mahavisandara Kyada, exist in up to 220 or 159 copies are known across just 4 provinces in Cambodia. This is, again, remembering that most or nearly all of the manuscripts in Cambodia were lost before 1990. And this is also true for a number of the other texts, all of which occur in numerous copies in different monastic collections, as well as some of the major libraries in Phnom Penh, showing their popularity up to the end of the period in which manuscripts were copied and the period for which most survived, between 1850 and 1950. We can also compare some of these manuscripts with an important transitional inscription between the middle and modern period, that of K892 at Wat Tatok in Srok Pok in Siem Reap province from 1857. And 5 of the manuscripts mentioned in that inscription also appear in these early inscriptions from the middle period. The remainder of the texts mentioned in that inscription are also ones that are largely, but not entirely, bilingual Pali-Khmer compositions, and ones that are quite commonly found in manuscript collections up to the present. Again, this as a basis for understanding the continuity of texts that we only have in a physical form from a quite late period, 1850 to 1950, being mentioned and almost certainly used over a much broader period. Here in just the last portion of my talk before I conclude, I want to give you a few examples of particular passages of some of the texts that are mentioned in these middle period inscriptions and how they work as Pali-Khmer bitexts. So the ones that I'll talk about are those here highlighted in green, the Sankia Yania Kraibai, the Mietapun, and the Anisang Pnuh, which are coming from these different genres within the broader category of bilingual preaching texts of this period. The first that I'll mention is this Sankia Yania Kraibai, or 3-seat sermon on the first council. And this text consists of an opening invocation, a quite detailed narration of the events leading up to the first council. That is this convocation of monks that supposedly happened shortly after the Buddha's passing away into Nirvana, in which the monastic community gathered to recite all of the sermons and other teachings that the Buddha gave during his lifetime. This particular text is structured again as a 3-seat sermon, in other words, involving 3 monks, one playing the role of the monk Mahakassapa, and another playing the role of the monk Upali, and a third playing the role of Ananda. There is a somewhat parallel text that would have been used in an equivalent ritual in Thailand, though that ritual has disappeared today, as far as I know, from modern Thailand, in a text known as the Pathoma Sankita Gatha. That particular text, though, is clearly not the source text for the 3-seat sermon on the First Council used in Cambodia today. And suggests that they may have emerged out of a common regional milieu, but that this particular Pali-Khmer bitext is not a translation of an existing Siamese bitext. The same applies to this text on the benefits of ordination in the middle here. It's related to a Pali text known as the Paramatamangala that's circulated in Southeast Asia, but it's not a direct translation of the closest equivalent Pali-Thai bitext, the Anisong Wanpasha. In fact, it's closer to a Pali Lana bitext that circulates in the region of Chiang Mai, known in the Lana language as Anisong Buat, of which the earliest surviving manuscript dates to around the period that it's actually the parallel Khmer text is mentioned in the inscriptional record from 1666 of the Common Era. And then finally, I'll look at a text that has no known parallels that I've been able to find in the Lao, Lana, or Thai manuscript traditions, this text known as the Mietapun Saut, or Discourse on the Buddha Repaying His Maternal Debt. First, in terms of the Sangkia Yiniakrai Bai, each of the texts that I'm going to show here as examples showcase a different aspect of how bilingual Pali-Khmer texts work and worked at this period. One way in which these texts can work as in a quite exegetically speaking, sophisticated process of rearranged phrasal gloss. That is, taking the words and phrases of a particular Pali phrase, which is first cited in full. Here it's a full gatha or verse in Pali, in this case from the Samantabhasadika. And then that is rearranged, sometimes amplified with additional Pali words and glossed in an extensive way into the vernacular language here in Khmer. So the colors here that I've added are just to give you a visual sense of how this original Pali verse is rearranged when it's taken into this gloss format. So the opening word yo remains at the beginning, but we see the word kapakoti is brought down into the middle of the text. Apamayam is brought up a little bit before that, and the enclitic word bi is dropped altogether in the Pali-Khmer bitext. And then there's also a process of extensive gloss. So the word yo and then a word from a little later in the text, nato, here are brought together in the beginning. And then this extensive technical gloss is given in Khmer as ri praang do chien yu chia ti pang bum ne nai Theravada no manuch phong tang la yai na mui, etc., etc. And then you also see towards the bottom that what I've highlighted in purple, some words in Pali that were only implied in the original Pali verse, but the author of the bitext needed to supply these additional Pali words in order to complete the gloss that they were doing on this text, and to make the entire paragraph form one concrete thought or grammatical sentence. So when we look at this in English translation, one part that I would highlight here in red is the use of these technical particles, which are in most cases not necessary in ordinary Khmer prose, but would have been added for this particular bitextual style. So here this NOM is standing for nominative, PL for plural, ACC for accusative, dative, imperative, adjectival form, etc. All of these are using particular Khmer technical particles like ri for the nominative case, no to mark an accusative, tenglai to mark a plural, jo to mark an imperative, da to mark an adjectival form, etc. And then we also see the ways in which the glosses expand on the meaning. So we take a term like practicing, which here is glossed as well, accumulating and ripening his holy perfections, or the simple word in Pali, kedang, or ketang in Khmer pronunciation, is glossed here as a state of exhaustion, distress, and anguish within his body. A different format or a different style of the Pali-Khmer bitext is that of the selective sentence gloss. I'm going to skip over this one quite briefly, but just in short, it involves taking the whole Pali sentence, then providing a long gloss on it here in Khmer. And when we translate that into English, the part that I've highlighted in yellow here is the part that's added. It's not at all a translation from the Pali, but it's extra narrative material that's being added to this text to enrich the bitext. We see a similar and even more expanded kind of bitextual narrative style in the Mitakun Sau. Here we have just a few Pali phrases that are brought out. These particular Pali phrases happen to come from one Pali version of the Bhattama-sambodhi, an important Southeast Asian biography of the Buddha. And the first of these phrases, Avasittame Mata, is given a long gloss in Khmer, and then in an even longer narrative portion that links what's happening between that particular quote and what's the next Pali quote that appears. And there's much of the original Pali here has been left out, has been elided. Only the most important parts are kept. This is the essential part of this narrative style that begins to dominate the the style of Pali vernacular texts, particularly sermons that were transmitted in by the 18th and 19th century in Cambodia. So in this narrative style, often it's the private thoughts or the external conversations of particular characters that are brought out in Pali, while the rest of the narrative is kept only in Khmer. And we can see this just in the translation of this particular section, where something like "My mother remains" is then translated here in a more expanded form into Khmer, and then a larger narrative section is inserted to weave together these different sections. So in conclusion here, the genres that Cambodian Buddhists transmitted between the late 16th and early 20th century, as far as the inscriptional record can help show us, include Pali chants, both Khmer and Thai poems used and recited in liturgical context, as well as what I've just been talking about, these bitextual Pali-Khmer sermons. In terms of how they evolved, we see that later on, particularly by the 18th and especially into the 19th century, there's a lot of direct translation happening from Thai and Pali-Thai bitexts into Khmer. But if we go back further, the sources seem more diverse. Sometimes the closest parallels are not actually in central Thailand or Siam. They're with Lana or Lao kinds of materials, showing a broader set of regional circulation of this material. And then finally, when thinking about this broader regional picture, we see in Cambodia, as in elsewhere in mainland Southeast Asia, bitexts flourished during the 16th to 19th century. It was the dominant form, both in religious texts as well as various forms of more secular, if we can use that term, sciences during this period, including some medical and legal texts. And then there's a transition in Cambodia towards more Siamese models that's accelerated by the innovations in Siamese monastic education, somewhat associated with the Dhammayutta Nikaya in the end of the 19th century, that transform the kinds of texts that are being transmitted, translated, and performed in Cambodia by the early 20th. So as I end here, I just wanted to highlight again how the technology of the bitext is something that allowed the Pali and vernacular worlds of Theravada Buddhism to remain in an intimate exchange and conversation throughout this period. And giving the cosmopolitan idiom of Pali, one that transcends different kinds of local vernacular languages and cultures, currency throughout this region up through the early 20th century. And it's at that point, and only at that point, that the first large-scale vernacular-only translation projects of Pali texts, including of the Buddhist canon, finally begin to take shape in the region, which is part of what brings an end to this era of bitexts in Southeast Asia. So that's all I have for today. Thank you very much for tuning in and for your attention. Before I stop sharing my slide and we transition to the question and answers, I'm just going to, for the sake of those of you watching this later and have the luxury of being able to pause the video, I'm just going to throw the bibliography for this presentation here. So you can further explore some of these sources at your leisure if you're interested. So with that, I'll stop sharing, and I really look forward to engaging your questions. Thank you all. So there's a number of questions that have come in already. So I'm going to read some of these out here and do my best to address them in the time we have. So one of you have asked if the emergence of these bitexts reflects a kind of vernacularization of Buddhism during the Middle Khmer period, then why don't we see bitextual liturgical or monastic chants along with these bilingual and locally accessible sermons? How might one interpret the restriction of bitexts to certain domains of Middle Khmer religious practice? This is a really fascinating question. Part of what we're seeing in terms of the inscriptional record is a certain bias. In other words, the inscriptional record is is biased towards the perspective of wealthy pilgrims and the scribes and perhaps also the monks who are involved in the preparation of these inscriptions. So we're seeing one particular aspect of the tradition. That which emphasizes the performance of certain ritually important Pali texts on the one hand in a monolingual Pali format, and also the recitation of these sermons in this bilingual format. What we're missing though a little bit is the side of monastic education and a sort of monk-centered perspective on Cambodian Buddhist literature. That we can see a little bit more in the manuscripts themselves. So in the context of Cambodia, as well as in other local Southeast Asian manuscript cultures, many of the Pali manuscripts feature interlinear annotations. The kind of bitexts that I was discussing today are primarily interphrasal. In other words, they're weaving together Pali and vernacular forms word by word. But in the context of monastic education, the interlinear format, where one would have a line of Pali and then above or below that line, sometimes both, all kinds of notes in the vernacular would be inserted. In some cases, there's a particular system of ciphers or numerals, or sometimes letters that are used to indicate the kinds of syntactic rearrangement that are taking place. In some cases, there are glosses into Pali or into Khmer or another vernacular language, all of which show the application of some of these principles of bitexts in the context of monastic education. Those texts, however, don't show up in the inscriptional record. We can guess from parallels in Thailand and Laos and the ways in which the monastic curricula developed there that perhaps those were in use in Cambodia at a relatively early period as well. But the inscriptions are unfortunately silent on this. Another question that's coming in is if I could talk a little bit more about the Buddhist centers of Lana around what's now Chiang Mai, Laos, particularly Luang Prabang and in other periods, Vientiane, and Burma, both Bagan and other places that became important centers of Buddhist learning and how they contributed to the regional development of Buddhism in Southeast Asia. One way that we see these centers as particularly important is in the composition of Pali texts in Southeast Asia. Something that's an anomaly, as it were, in the Cambodian context is that we have very few texts entirely in Pali that we know to have been composed by Cambodian authors. There are a few inscriptions that are entirely or partially in Pali, and there are certain kinds of opening phrases in Pali-Khmer bitexts and other instances in the manuscripts where we see short portions of Pali being composed by Cambodians. By and large, during this period of Middle Cambodia, most of the authorship of texts entirely in Pali was taking place in the particular centers that the questioner just mentioned about in Lana, Laos, and in Burma. And texts produced in those places, including texts like the Pathamasambodhi, texts like the Mangalata Dipani, texts like the Panyasa Jataka, texts that became extremely important in the later monastic curricula of the region, including in Cambodia, circulated throughout these different regions. But in addition, and that story has been told in powerful ways. There's a really fascinating recent article by Gregory Kuruski about some of the Pali manuscripts composed in Lana during this same period. On the other hand, there's the bitextual format was also a key vehicle for the sharing and spread of Buddhist compositions across Southeast Asia during this period. And the reason is that it's particularly easy to translate a text, say, that's written in it as a Pali-Siamese bitext into a Pali-Khmer bitext, because one can rely on both the Pali and the Siamese sections of the text to be able to come up with a satisfactory bitext in Khmer. And we see this constant exchange and circulation of all kinds of bitextual compositions throughout the region. And it's these bitexts that are actually, again, much more numerically significant in the monastic traditions of and libraries that survive throughout mainland Southeast Asia. Most of the exchange that I'm aware of takes place within the Bai and Khmer worlds, that is in what's now Laos, Thailand, and then also in Cambodia. There are, though, a few bitexts I've examined from Lan Na in northern Thailand that very clearly in their colophon state that they were translated from a Burmese exemplar or recording the oral teachings of a particular visiting Burmese monk. So there are also connections that are happening across that cultural border as well. Another question that someone has asked, if I could talk a little bit more about the interaction between the monastic communities in these different places. So something I mentioned already was the colophons that mention how particular Cambodian monks traveled to, say, Ayutthaya and brought back manuscripts or commissioned manuscripts there to be brought back to Cambodia. We also see, again, in the 18th century, in a colophon of a particular Khmer Buddhist poem, the mention that its translator had found this poem in Siamese while studying in Ayutthaya and thought that it would be an excellent poem to translate into Khmer and for the purpose of reciting to Buddhists in Cambodia. So we see these clues that show us something around what kinds of travel was happening. In terms of the networks of travel, we begin to get a little bit more concrete evidence by the middle of the 19th century. There's a wonderful PhD dissertation by Thibodi Wokamsi that he completed at the University of California, Berkeley, where he looks at some of the ways that not just monastics, but also all kinds of what he frames as ordinary people, how they circulated texts and ideas throughout Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia at this time. With regards to the somewhat later period during the 1920s and 1930s, some of you may know that this is the period that the French colonial government was trying to promote a kind of cooperation between Buddhists and particularly the Buddhist education system in Cambodia and the Institut Bouddhique, or the Buddhist Institute there, and in Laos. And one trace of the manuscript dimension and the bitextual dimension to this exchange is a set of manuscripts of Pali texts that were originally inscribed in Cambodia, part of the main curricular texts that monks used to study to pass their monastic examinations in this period. A number of those texts that have Khmer colophons, in some cases even lots of Khmer annotations on this text, were then brought up to different places in Laos. And in Lao manuscript collections, including in Vientiane and in Luang Prabang, we see instances of Lao monastic students then re-annotating those texts in Tam Lao script, forming this fascinating interplay of Lao and Khmer annotations upon this Pali text. We have another question that just jumped in here. Someone mentioned the question of when Middle Khmer started and ended. This is I'm not a linguist, and the definitions of what counts as the Angkorian Khmer or the particular dialect of Old Khmer we see in the Angkorian inscriptions. How does that shade into the relatively few inscriptions we see in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries? What's linguistically happening in that transition, and what we see in the inscriptions that I was talking about today between the 16th and 18th centuries is hard for me to tell. Certainly there are aspects of grammatical particles, rhyme patterns that are related to the shift in the pronunciation of vowels that took place during this period that can be useful in helping to date certain features of Middle Khmer. This very simple definition that I was using is not a linguistically robust one, but it's just referring to texts produced between the 14th or 15th and 19th century that are reflecting a particular political reality of Cambodia when the power centers were centered away from Angkor and closer to Phnom Penh. Another question here is around the syllable configuration or the structures of words, or how words are strung together. How are they different from modern Khmer? So in many respects, the texts represented in the manuscripts are not particularly different. One reason for that is that certain aspects of Buddhist discourse, particularly that used in sermons in Cambodia, has conservative qualities to it. So more archaic particles and other aspects of writing get preserved in these materials and may be familiar to those who have heard these kinds of traditional sermons today. And one, I think, advantage of that, and something that I'm really excited about in terms of the digitization of these manuscripts and making them, available on a wide scale, is that for Cambodians who are already literate in their own language, it usually only takes a few weeks or at most a few months to become comfortable in reading the manuscripts that survive. The spelling and the form of particular letters can initially be a bit bewildering because it's different than the way that Khmer has been written, particularly in the past 100 years. After the standardization of spelling that began to take place in the early 20th century. But when read aloud, the texts feel really immediate and in some cases fresh to a modern reader. So I'm really excited about what scholars in Cambodia will be able to do more with these texts as they study literature, Buddhist texts, historical texts, and all the other kinds of fascinating documents that have been preserved within the manuscript tradition. I think I've come to the end of the questions. So thank you all very much again for your questions and for your engagement. I really appreciate it.
I just wanted to take a moment to thank Trent one more time for this fascinating lecture, which even as an archaeologist, I enjoyed. And also to express enthusiasm for the upcoming accessibility of these digitized texts that will really change Khmer studies and Khmer scholarship for the next generation. So thank you very much for telling us about it and for talking with us today. Thanks to everyone for joining us, and we hope we get to see you face to face soon. Goodbye.